Before we can talk about the abandoned Dero, we first have to talk about Richard Shaver. Richard Shaver wrote a 10,000-word manuscript called A Warning to Future Man. He then sent the manuscript to Ray Palmer, who was an editor for a magazine. Now, Ray Palmer took that 10,000 words and turned it into a story called I Remember Lemura. I know these beings exist because I saw one, and I have two more stories besides my own that I'm going to share with you. I will tell you the basics of the I Remember Lemura story, and then we will get to the good part, the encounters. 12,000 years ago, the Atlans lived on Earth. They were a very advanced society and they had high technology. Well, during this time frame, around 12,000 years ago, the solar flare coming from the sun hit the Earth and devastated the planet. People began to go underground into subterranean realms to escape the exposure to the detrimental rays of the sun, and that's how this other group of people who were the human type beings on the planet became Dero. Now the hollow earth theory is where there is a center sun and people live inside the earth. Now that's not to be confused with subterranean realms where people live within the crust of the earth. After the solar flare hit the earth, everything had radiation poisoning. So the ancients, who had the high technology, they fled the planet in spaceships into outer space. Now the people left behind were abandoned and they became Dero. DE is for detrimental and RO is for robot, not meaning that they were actual robots, but they were degraded due to detrimental energy from the radiation and robotic in nature, but they ended up being reprobate in nature and couldn't control themselves and became somewhat evil. And then there were also Teros on the planet, and the Teros were supposedly or allegedly the good guys. So they fled into the crust of the earth into subterranean realms to avoid the radiation of the sun and the radiation poisoning on the earth, but due to having to pump in their oxygen and water and things like that they got from the planet, the radiation was impossible to keep out, and over time it degraded them into Dero, and that's the terms that Richard Shaver used. All the technology that was left behind was gathered up by the Dero and the Tero. The Dero are against human beings, while the Tero tried to protect human beings. Now, the Dero wreak havoc and try to rule over the surface population, while the Tero try to protect the surface population. They also had crafts that we would call flying saucers that traveled through the tunnel systems that would go and connect between continents and maybe even go under oceans and connect these cavernous regions, and these ships can fly through the tunnels and not touch the walls, the ceilings, or the floor, and were robotically or mechanistic controlled through the tunnel systems to help them transport themselves and materials one place to another. According to Richard Shaver, these beings also come to the surface to get materials. They need supplies from the surface world. Sometimes they come up through elevators in very secretive places that come up into apartment buildings, and they have a secret code that could make the elevator go on down past the basement floor that people are not aware of. They're supposedly very, very secret about it and have ray guards that guard the openings. They might come up into subways in many different secretive ways that these beings can come to the surface and get materials and take them down below. One of the most disturbing elements of this whole story, according to Richard Shaver, is that these Deros come to the surface to kidnap people. And they take these people underground and they serve as slaves. Now, the slave population is about 10 to 1 to these Deros. And there we get into some things where these encounters begin to make some kind of sense, whether or not they are what they say they are, or whether you agree with Richard Shaver. There are some people that have seen these beings, and we will look at a few of these cases and try to discover what they are and why they do it. Richard Shaver also said that they had very, very high technology type weapons, and they seemed to be directed energy type weapons that could put thoughts in your head and even read your mind. All kinds of weapons that could be used for good or for bad. And the guard people who guard the openings to these things, these underground realms, were called ray guards, and they used certain types of weapons to guard the entrances to the underworld, while the Dero used these weapons to torment people on the surface world, where people might have cases where they hear voices and get accused of having schizophrenia, and many cases that we find in this day and age of people like Aaron Alexis, the shipyard shooter, who was hearing voices and claiming people were targeting him through the ceilings or through the floor or through the walls, and he was hearing voices. They wouldn't let him sleep, and all kinds of things that ended up making him go crazy and shooting people at the Navy shipyard. And I think maybe he was being targeted, whether it was by the military or the Dero or a combination of both, who knows. But they had very high technology that they could target people with. Some of you have seen my story called Hollow Earth, My Encounter with the Dero. Well, after viewing that story, I had a man who sent his story to me and asked me if I would share it. And it goes like this. I was laying in my bed at night, and I was 18 years old. I was scared of the dark at that time, so I always had a flashlight under my pillow. My dog was with me on the foot of the bed, and all of a sudden I heard a honking laugh. Honk, 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 honk. And I wondered what it was, so I got the flashlight from under the pillow and I shined it up at this being. He was standing at the foot of the bed, and he had a long nose and blue around the nose. The being told me, if you move, I will hurt your family, so hold still. The being then came around to the side of the bed, and the dog had just took off because it was scared. Well, he came to the side of the bed and he stuck this instrument to the side of my head near my eye, on the temple area. When he did that, I felt a very sharp pain and it hurt for a minute. And then the being proceeded to laugh in that honking sound again. Honk, 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 honk. The being then told me, I am from a forest called Whitaker. And then at that point, the being laughed some more, honk, honk, a honking laugh that was spooky. The being was not worried about me or what I was going to do. And at that point, there was a loud scream, and it was so loud that it hurt my ears. And then the being disappeared, and I looked over to find my dog, and it was hiding in the corner of the room. And at some point, this being told me, and I can't remember when it was exactly, but he told me he was a demon. The being also told me he was from another planet. So he was from a forest named Whitaker, from another planet. I really would like for you to go watch my story when this video is over and compare it to how similar it is to this man's story. And now we will get to story number 2. December 24th, 1945. The day before Christmas, I decided to go to Thom McAn's store to get a new pair of shoes. The store was located on the corner of South Saginaw Street and Union in Flint, Michigan, about 3 blocks from where I lived. It was a dreary day with a steady, light snow, just warm enough to make the streets wet and sloppy. As I stood at the intersection facing the Retallo Theater and waiting for the signal light to change, I felt a very strong sensation come over me, and my eyes were drawn to 2 people standing under the light post across the street. This couple exerted a strange pull on me, with my eyes becoming attuned to theirs. I stood magnetically transfixed, unable to move and unaware of my surroundings. At last my mind became completely attuned to theirs, and our eyes seemed to pierce each other's. There are no words to explain the wild panorama of thoughts and feelings that came over me. Telepathically, they impressed me that they were Teros, and that I knew them personally, and knew that they were Teros from a cavern world. Soon the light changed, and as they crossed the street, they passed within 6 feet of me. I decided to walk over to them while I searched for the right words to start a conversation. Try as I may, my body would not respond to what I wanted to do and to what my mind was telling it to do. In those few seconds when they passed so close to me, their eyes did not waver right or left, and their thoughts left a mark in my mind. They seemed to say, "Guard your thoughts from unfriendly rays." I was stunned and speechless as I helplessly watched them go up the street with the crowd of Christmas shoppers. At that moment, I was again able to move. Just as they seemed to merge into the crowd and disappear, hastily I walked after them, and I assure you that I could not catch up to them. But try as I may, I couldn't find them. It appeared as if they had become one with the other people. As I rushed to the spot where last I saw them, I physically examined the crowd of people. The couple had simply disappeared or became invisible from my mind. Later, when I returned home, I slouched into my easy chair and privately mulled over the whole experience in my mind. I considered writing down the events and to send them to Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver. As I thought about it, I got a strange feeling they wouldn't really believe me, and I shouldn't tell anyone. I was impressed that this experience was for me alone, and that possibly Shaver or Palmer would not believe me. As I thought it over, it appeared in my mind that these 2 strange people didn't want to be exposed, that they might get into some kind of trouble from the ray guards of the underworld. I didn't want them to get into trouble over me, so I never bothered Shaver or Palmer with my story, nor anyone else until now as I write this material from Shavertron. I must first get you to realize that in 1945, when this happened to me, there was no source whatsoever outside of Shaver and Palmer to help explain the experience which I had. Today, there are hundreds of ufological searchers presenting material which would and does explain what I encountered. Only in 1946 issue of Amazing Stories was a Tero ever described by Richard Shaver. First, I'll attempt to describe the male Tero. He was about 6'3" and about 175 pounds. He appeared thin and lean, yet with physically strong limbs and structure. His nose was one that is not easily forgotten. It extended down and curved under his chin. I can only say that it must have been at least 7 or 8 inches long. His facial complexion had a very gray ashen hue and was quite pitted or pockmarked. His cheeks shallow, and his eyes were gray or blue-gray. I only saw his left earlobe, but it was exceedingly long. His attire was the early 1920s, all in differing shades of gray. His hat was extremely large for his head, which pricked my curiosity further. Thoughts passing through my mind said that there was some kind of mechanical device connected with his hat, and that somehow it was attuned to his hands, which were resting in his pockets of his long overcoat. I was impressed that he didn't want anyone to see his hands. The bulge in his pocket looked almost like a small pistol, but I got the feeling that it was a large T-log device connected with his head and his hands. At the time of this encounter, I was able to analyze them through ESP and keep in mind minute details about them. While still other thoughts flowed in mind, I was aware of Shaver, as if they were letting me know that Shaver was right. These thoughts reached me even though there was an attempt to cover up the ray guards, for I was aware of a far-off conversation of thoughts with my own inner vision. The woman appeared to be from 22 to 26 years of age and maybe 5'4". She had a beautiful olive complexion, like someone had been taking a lot of sun baths at a beach in Florida or California. Her eyes were very large with deep black orbs which seemed to penetrate into my thoughts. Her face was small with a delicate nose, mouth, and chin, which made her eyes very predominant. I became aware of her unusual inner beauty more so than her physical beauty. She too was telling me that she was from the cavern world while making an effort to guard her identity and protect herself from the unfriendly rays. Her clothing, like her companion, was from the 1920s. They were drab and had seen better days. She wore a coat dark brown that reached below her knees, and her stockings were of the old cotton style. Her hat, too, was very unusual, and I sensed that it also had some kind of connection with the mechanical device in her hat and purse. This hat looked like a lampshade of deep purple felt, and her small purse was the same color. She wore brown gloves, having her arm linked through the arm of her companion, staying very close together as if to keep warm. I noticed she had on galoshes and he wore rubbers on his shoes, because I was very aware of the footprints in the snow and the slush as they walked past me. It is entirely possible that the woman may have been born on the surface and at some time encouraged or encountered a Tero who may have indoctrinated her into cavern life as a go-between for the two worlds. Now, Shaver said in an interview with Long John Nebo back in 1954 that these Tero and Dero were demonized, and none of them were necessarily good. And some of the creatures that were in the Shaver mystery had horns and tails and things like that. So I'm going to leave it up to you, the viewer, to decide what you think. Now, this experience that this guy had that I told a minute ago, that he had this creature tell him that he was a demon, that's very suspect, and some of the abilities that these creatures have seem to be similar to abduction scenarios and other types, sleep paralysis scenarios, and different situations that I've run across in all these videos and studies that I've done. So subscribe, comment, and please share these videos for me, because it really helps me out in keeping this channel going. Thank you very much for watching, and I will look forward to hearing from you. All your comments, I really appreciate them, and no matter if you agree with me or not, thank you very much. So be sure to share these videos and go watch other videos on my channel. Check out the other video that I have, Hollow Earth, my encounter with the Dero, and compare it to the first scenario and encounter that I told you about. Goodbye, and see you on the next video.